Most people think spiritual awakening feels like floating on clouds, radiating love, and getting instant clarity, but Carl Jung would probably chuckle at that idea. Because the real awakening, the one that touches the unconscious mind, usually begins with resistance. Not from you, but from the people around you. Strange, right? You heal, and somehow they get uncomfortable. It's not personal. When your consciousness expands, their ego senses the shift. Suddenly, your presence challenges the stories they've told about themselves and about you. You stop playing the same emotional roles, and the air changes. You're still you, but they don't know how to relate to this new version. Some feel curious, others confused, and a few get defensive without knowing why. It's a bit like the movie starring Julia Roberts, Eat, Pray, Love. Remember how Liz just wanted to breathe again, rebuild herself, rediscover meaning? She wasn't trying to hurt anyone. She wasn't attacking or preaching. She simply followed an inner voice that whispered, "There's more to you than this." But to do that, she had to leave environments where her change felt like a threat. Her transformation stirred the waters, not because she was wrong, but because she stopped pretending. You're not buying a one-way ticket to Italy or meditating in an ashram, but energetically, it's the same leap. You let go of the old script, and suddenly some people react as if you abandoned them, when, in truth, you simply stopped abandoning yourself. And this is where the tension builds. While you feel called to grow, someone close may feel left behind. Not because they don't love you, but because your transformation reminds them of the path they haven't taken. So yes, awakening can feel like a quiet revolution, a gentle turning of the heart that no longer begs for permission. It's simple, but powerful. And once this shift begins, something becomes very clear. Walking your path won't always make others comfortable, but it will make you whole. They say that when you experience a spiritual awakening, the room doesn't look different, yet somehow everything feels changed. It's as if the unconscious mind begins speaking a new language, one made of symbols, synchronicity explained not by chance, but by intention. In Jungian psychology, this is the moment when the self whispers louder than the persona. You're not running from life. You're simply listening to a deeper frequency, where archetypes and the hero's journey start guiding your steps. There's a subtle invitation toward inner alchemy, where light and darkness finally meet. Even the silence seems to hold meaning. And funny enough, people notice, though they don't always understand why. You begin to feel your emotions with new clarity, like emotional awareness is no longer optional. The human psyche becomes something alive, a map you're learning to navigate. There's a sensation that the power of the mind stretches further than you ever imagined. Carl Jung would have said the collective unconscious is nudging you forward, asking you to explore dream interpretation, symbols, and meaning, and the hidden shadow that's been waiting to be integrated. You might feel called to journaling, meditation, or simply observing your breath. These practices anchor you as your old identity loosens. And some mornings, you wake up sensing that life itself is speaking through you. You start noticing subtle shifts around you. Friends comment that you feel different, even though you haven't changed your clothes, your job, or your routine. This is inner transformation in its most organic form, quiet, yet undeniable. Shadow work begins without permission. Memories rise, old emotions surface, and the repressed self asks to be seen. The unconscious mind seems to guide you toward healing the inner child, reminding you of forgotten dreams and unfinished stories. You might stumble upon a random quote about the wounded healer or the alchemy of trauma and feel like it's speaking directly to you. It's not coincidence. It's synchronicity explained by alignment rather than luck. At times, you feel both excitement and confusion. One moment you're laughing at how obvious everything suddenly seems, like realizing how psychological archetypes have shaped your relationships forever. The next moment, you're questioning the meaning of life, wondering how symbols show up in everyday life, why certain songs resonate, or why strangers feel familiar. Your emotional body sharpens. Projection and perception are no longer abstract concepts, but living forces. You start seeing the shadow in relationships, not as evil, but as invitations for growth. Even heartbreak looks different. It becomes part of the individuation process, a gentle initiation. Some evenings, you sit alone in your room, noticing how consciousness expands without effort. You watch dreams turn into teachers, Jungian dream symbols revealing messages you used to ignore. You sense that light and darkness are not enemies. They are parents of the same truth. You remember stories of people who packed backpacks and went to the mountains seeking answers. But here you are, discovering them in your own heart. And just when you begin to feel comfortable, something curious happens. Your new presence becomes a mirror, and what others see in you may not always be what you expect. When you begin waking up, something subtle but powerful happens. Your presence stops being just you and starts functioning like a mirror. People look at you and, without realizing it, see parts of their own unconscious mind reflected back. It's not mystical in a dramatic way. It's simply the nature of consciousness. Jungian psychology calls this projection and perception. What they can't face inside, they project outward. Suddenly, the quirks, dreams, and inner transformation you're experiencing trigger others, not because you've changed too much, but because they are seeing psychological archetypes inside themselves that they've avoided. It's like you've turned the lights on in a room they preferred to keep dim. Some people may feel fascinated, drawn to your energy, as if Jung and modern psychology suddenly makes sense on a gut level. Others may feel uncomfortable, even defensive, because your presence touches their repressed self. You might just be talking about dream interpretation or the symbolism of light and darkness, and they react like you've exposed their diary. They don't understand that you're simply witnessing your own inner alchemy, learning about the hero's journey and the quiet conversations happening inside the unconscious mind. And here's the twist. You're not trying to teach or preach. Just being is enough for their unconscious to wake up. You might notice that people treat you differently without any logical explanation. They show admiration, envy, or irritation, sometimes all in the same day. Their emotions come from the shadow in relationships. Your growth highlights what they haven't faced. Imagine telling someone that you're practicing shadow work or healing the inner child. Instead of cheering you on, they get defensive. Why are you so serious lately? But it's not your path that disturbs them. It's the reflection of their own path, the one they've postponed. That's the alchemy of trauma. When you choose healing through awareness, you remind others they could do the same. There's a quiet humor in observing how symbols and meaning arise in everyday life. A friend might mock your interest in the collective unconscious, but then tells you a dream that screams with Jungian dream symbols. Another may roll their eyes when you talk about self-awareness, but later confesses that your words kept them awake at night. The inner voice of the self moves silently, stirring questions about the meaning of life. Sometimes, strangers feel instantly connected to you, as if recognizing an archetype you carry, maybe the wounded healer, maybe the trickster, maybe the seeker. They feel it before they understand it. And as your presence grows clearer, you begin to understand why Jung said that the shadow hides not only darkness but also unrealized light. You realize that what people reject in you is often what they've rejected in themselves. So you show up with more compassion, knowing that every reaction is a conversation between their shadow and your awakening. Even so, this new dynamic can be strange, because as your inner transformation deepens, some will lean in while others step back. And this shift leads to a natural resistance, where their ego tries to protect the familiar. When your spiritual awakening deepens, it's almost like the lights turn on inside your inner house, and suddenly you can see every corner clearly. The unconscious mind begins speaking louder, and what was once ignored becomes impossible to overlook. The ego, used to running the show, gets uncomfortable, sometimes even scared. Jungian psychology would say you're stepping out of the persona and closer to the self, and that shift threatens everything built on old stories. You notice how the human psyche resists inner alchemy. It prefers familiar pain over unfamiliar freedom. And that resistance doesn't only happen inside you, people around you feel it too, because your transformation touches the collective unconscious they are also part of. There's a strange moment when friends and family look at you as though they barely recognize you, like you've changed languages overnight. You start talking about shadow work, dream interpretation, emotional awareness, Jung and modern psychology, or even symbols and meaning you've noticed in your daily life. Instead of curiosity, you get awkward silences or dismissive jokes. Someone might laugh and say, "Oh, now you're some kind of philosopher." Not because they think you're wrong, but because what you're awakening threatens the narrative they built about who you are. Your inner transformation becomes a quiet invitation for them to look at their own unconscious mind, and that's uncomfortable. You'll notice this especially with family. Parents can panic when their child, no matter the age, begins questioning old beliefs. The ego in family systems is powerful. It tries to maintain the old balance, the roles everyone's used to. Maybe you were the quiet one, the peacemaker, the one who never questioned anything. After a spiritual awakening, when you begin practicing self-awareness, healing the inner child, and integrating the repressed self, the family's collective ego senses the shift. Someone might say, "You're acting strange," or "You think you're better than us now." But what they really mean is, "You're changing the dance steps we've danced for years, and now we don't know what to do with you." Friends feel it too. A close friend might subtly withdraw, because seeing you walk your hero's journey forces them to face their own stagnation. Maybe you stop participating in the same gossip, drinking, or complaining rituals that used to bond you. Suddenly, the shadow in relationships becomes clear. Some friendships were built on shared wounds rather than shared growth. When you start healing, the emotional alchemy shifts the equation. One friend might say, "You're no fun anymore," but underneath, it's the wounded ego grieving the old dynamic. It's not that they don't love you, they just don't yet know how to love the new you. Sometimes, the pushback comes disguised as concern. A relative might say, "I'm just worried you're disconnecting from reality." But you know you're becoming more conscious, not less. When you begin noticing psychological archetypes in everyday life, or synchronicity explained through the lens of depth psychology, some people feel threatened. They might not have the tools to understand what you're doing, so the ego reacts with fear. This is where compassion becomes essential. You're not here to convince anyone. You're just decoding your dreams, integrating the persona and shadow, glimpsing the meaning of life. And that journey is personal. Your own ego fights too. It remembers comfort, even if that comfort was self-abandonment. You'll feel moments of doubt. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm just imagining all this? These questions are normal during the individuation process. The unconscious mind is inviting you to step beyond the narrative, but the ego fears losing control. Sometimes, you'll even sabotage your growth just to feel normal again, watching mind-numbing shows, diving into old habits, or putting away your journal that knows too much. But each time you do that, a subtle ache reminds you that the old balance is no longer home. As this process unfolds, family dynamics may intensify. You'll notice roles shifting. The outspoken sibling might suddenly be defensive. The quiet sibling may become more curious. Certain family gatherings may feel heavy, like everyone's pretending not to feel the tension sitting at the dinner table. If you try introducing topics like the wounded healer, archetypes, or the power of the mind, some may roll their eyes. It's okay. The unconscious isn't on a deadline. You're not here to convert anyone. You're here to embody your truth. Over time, the ones who once resisted may come to you privately, saying, "Hey, you mentioned something the other day. Can you tell me more?" And friendships. Oh, friendships get interesting. Some connections dissolve like sand slipping through your fingers. People you thought would be in your life forever drift away. Not because either of you is wrong, but because shadow integration techniques and spiritual awakening change your emotional frequency. You begin choosing conversations that reflect consciousness, not chaos. You notice the symbolism of light and dark in interactions. The way some conversations drain you while others nourish you. A friend who once felt like home may feel like an old room you've outgrown. It's not personal. It's psychological projection in love and friendship doing its quiet math. There is grief hidden here too. You may miss the old rhythm, the old laughter, the ease of not thinking so deeply. Sometimes you long for the days when you didn't know about individuation, archetypes, or how to face your shadow. But that nostalgia passes when you remember why you started. The alchemy of trauma shapes you into someone who doesn't just survive, someone who integrates, someone who embodies the inner voice of the self. In these moments, grounding helps. A slow walk, breath work, talking to someone who understands Jungian psychology, or reading a page from a book like Man and His Symbols to remind yourself you're not crazy, you're evolving. Eventually, you realize that the ego's resistance, from you and from others, wasn't an enemy. It was a guardian, protecting the old balance until you were strong enough to move beyond it. And as you grow more comfortable with light and darkness coexisting in your human psyche, you stop resisting the resistance. Instead, you observe, you breathe, you choose, and slowly, you embody a quieter truth, one that doesn't need to argue or defend itself. From this place, a new lesson arrives. As your inner transformation matures, something unexpected happens. You stop needing to prove anything. The unconscious mind becomes your quiet advisor, and silence turns into a wise companion rather than an awkward gap to fill. You begin to understand what Carl Jung meant when he spoke of the power of the mind and the inner voice of the self guiding the individuation process. Instead of reacting to every misunderstanding, you pause. You breathe. You sense which responses come from your shadow and which come from your higher self-awareness. And little by little, you discover that not every argument deserves your energy, especially those born from someone else's unprocessed unconscious. It's not that you become passive or fearful. Actually, you become stronger. You learn that choosing silence is a form of emotional alchemy, transforming knee-jerk reactions into conscious responses. You start recognizing psychological archetypes in everyday life, noticing when someone is speaking from their persona or projecting their repressed self onto you. Sometimes, a family member or friend tries to provoke you into old conflicts, but the shadow in relationships becomes so obvious that you just smile. You're no longer interested in wrestling with someone's wounded ego. You've begun healing the inner child that once needed validation, and now silence feels like protection rather than surrender. Choosing silence doesn't mean you stop caring. It actually means you care differently. You realize that every person is walking their own hero's journey, wrestling with their own light and darkness. So you no longer take every rude comment personally. When someone blames you, mocks your spiritual awakening, or dismisses concepts like dream interpretation, shadow work, or Jung and modern psychology, you recognize projection at play. Even when someone sarcastically says, "Oh, now you think you're enlightened," you don't get defensive. You understand they're speaking from a place where their unconscious mind feels threatened. So instead of explaining yourself endlessly, you give them space and give yourself peace. At times, silence becomes a practical tool. Imagine you're at a family dinner and someone challenges your new path. Why are you so different lately? In the past, you might have launched into explanations about the collective unconscious, synchronicity explained, or the symbolism of light and dark. Now, you simply say something gentle like, "I'm learning more about myself." No debate, no preaching. Later, when you're alone, you might journal about how that moment made you feel, honoring your emotional awareness rather than forcing others to understand. You realize that real growth isn't about convincing anyone. It's about embodying your inner alchemy quietly. And here's the paradox. When you stop trying to change people, you begin influencing them more deeply. Your silence becomes a mirror pointing them back to their own inner transformation. Some may feel inspired, others may feel confronted. But that's the nature of depth psychology. The unconscious mind speaks louder than words. Eventually, you see that silence is not emptiness, it's presence. It guards your energy, preserves your clarity, and invites others to explore their own shadows at their own pace. And when people try to pull you back into old dynamics, silence reminds you that true awakening isn't about winning arguments. It's about walking fearlessly in your truth, even when misunderstood. At a certain point in your spiritual awakening, you stop fearing how others see you. Projection and perception still happen, because they are part of the human psyche, but they no longer dictate your path. You recognize that when someone reacts strongly to your choices, it's often their unconscious mind speaking, not their truth. Jungian psychology teaches that people project both their light and darkness, their longing and fear. So instead of shrinking yourself or performing a persona to make everyone comfortable, you walk openly, trusting your inner transformation, even when others misunderstand. You realize that their narratives tell you more about their shadow than about your identity. This shift feels like emotional alchemy. You notice when a friend labels your growth as weird, or when a family member suggests you overthinking life, and you understand they are responding to their own repressed self. Maybe you begin exploring dream interpretation, synchronicity explained, or shadow work, and someone rolls their eyes. That used to sting. Now, it feels different. You see the archetypes in everyday life playing out. Someone embodying the judge, the skeptic, the wounded healer, or the hero resisting the call. You don't need to fight it or persuade anyone. You simply keep walking, trusting the inner voice of the self as it guides your individuation process. And here's the fascinating part. Embracing projection as a natural phenomenon actually liberates you. You stop trying to manage everyone's perception. You stop tailoring your truth to avoid discomfort. Instead, you stand rooted in consciousness, healing the inner child that once needed approval. When someone accuses you of being too sensitive, you recognize that sensitivity is simply emotional awareness, an ability to see light and darkness in yourself and others. You know that real intimacy requires shadow integration techniques, honesty, presence, and the courage to face your own wounded places. So you hold space for others' reactions while honoring your own truth, without abandoning yourself. There's a strength that arrives quietly, almost unnoticed. You begin trusting the meaning of life as it reveals itself through symbols and synchronicity. You understand how the collective unconscious links us, how narcissism and the unconscious often blur together when people feel threatened. You stop expecting others to validate your inner alchemy because you've become your own witness. And when relationships shift, because some will, you don't panic. You know the hero's journey requires letting go of certain paths to follow the one you're called to. Sometimes that means stepping away from environments where the shadow in relationships is constantly projected onto you. It's not rejection, it's alignment. Soon, you realize that walking without fear of projection means you're no longer controlled by interpretations, yours or theirs. You understand that Jung and modern psychology give language to these inner movements, but the real transformation happens when you live them. Each step becomes a dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious mind, between the persona and shadow, between who you were and who you're becoming. And the more you trust this process, the more life reveals itself, not as chaos, but as guidance. Bit by bit, you learn that the only real safety is authenticity, even if others don't see you clearly. Because something deeper is unfolding, and soon, it leads you into a new threshold of truth. If your spiritual awakening is changing the way people respond to you, good. It means you're moving. Now the question is, what will you do with this awareness? Will you keep shrinking to fit old versions of yourself? Or finally walk in your truth, even when others don't understand? You don't need to explain. You don't need to convince. Just notice what happens when you choose silence instead of conflict, presence instead of defense, and clarity instead of fear. Watch how your relationships respond, not to judge, but to understand where your energy is truly welcome. This week, try one simple practice. When someone triggers you, pause and just observe. No automatic reaction, just awareness. You'll be surprised by what shifts inside you. Now tell me, which part of this journey are you in right now? Have people reacted differently as you've changed? Share your experience in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this message resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can keep learning, growing, and awakening with us.